Hi guys, welcome to this brief lecture over elections and voting behavior. This is chapter 10 in the book. I'm going to cruise through these first two slides because we will be doing these activities in class. And let's look at some terms that you should know really well by now. Primary elections versus general elections. So if you're participating in a primary, this is when you are determining who the party nominee is going to be. And this could be for elections at the state and local level. It can be for national elections. It can be for the presidential election. It's only for the presidential election in which there are delegates that are chosen that go to the Republican or Democrat National Convention. For other elections, it's going to be a primary, and so you're going to pick from a group of Republicans, say, for governor or for U.S. Senate, but you don't have delegates that are selected. The general election then looks at the parties who have been, or the nominees who have been selected from each party in the primary process. So again, it can be for any level of election in government. So it can be state and local, it can be national, it can be for the president. But the general election then is where there's one Republican, one Democrat, maybe there's one Libertarian or Green Party, and they're all competing for that position. The number one way that Americans participate in elections is with the presidential election. So we see larger numbers come out for presidential elections. It's still very, very dismal, the number of people that come out, in particular compared to other countries. Some other countries make sure that it's mandatory that you do participate in elections. And so you actually can get fined if you don't participate. Germany is holding an election today. I'm recording this on Sunday. September 24th, and Germany is holding their election on a Sunday. So their voter numbers are higher than what we will see in the United States, in particular when you have elections during the week, and oftentimes people can't get to the polls. Nevertheless, the presidential elections are when people are going to be more likely to vote. The way that people participate civically in the government or in policy-making process or with their community, oftentimes the number one way that they participate civically is just through voting. So another way that you can participate in your government is through initiatives and referendums. So let me explain what those are. So referendums, ratifying a policy proposed by the state legislature. In Idaho, the people have to pass a referendum to add an amendment to the state's constitution. It can also be something that the state legislature wants the people to directly vote on as well. Maybe it's kind of controversial or something and they want to hear the people's voice. So referendums mean that the people are going to have a voice in that. And but those start in the state legislature, if that makes sense. Initiatives are things that start with the people. So this is a way of bypassing the legislative branch totally in a state. And so citizens usually do this by getting signatures on a proposed law. And the number of signatures is different from state to state. It usually has to equal 1/10 of the number of voters in a previous election. They have to get that number of signatures. So that's kind of a general guideline, but sometimes states have harder processes that you have to go through to get an initiative. So a lot of times you may see people passing around petitions at different public events trying to get enough signatures. The signatures have to be valid Idaho state residents, and they have to be, of course, 18 or older. They do not have to be registered voters, but they do have to be 18 or older, and they have to be residents of the state. So the only way, we may have talked about this in class too, but the only way that Idaho may ever have legalized marijuana could be through this sort of initiative process that citizens do. And then, of course, the legislature could fire back by passing their own laws that overrides that initiative that was passed by the people. So basically, you create some sort of piece of legislation, you get enough signatures for it, then it goes to a vote. So it depends on when the next election is, voting time is, and you would be voting on that initiative at that time. There's also a recall vote, and the recall vote is when you actually want to remove a state or local officer before the end of his or her term. So you can, again, get enough signatures to hold a recall vote and then have that recall vote. And this has happened in various different states. Governor Scott Walker, there was a recall vote a few years ago on him. He's a Republican in Wisconsin. And there was a recall vote after he pretty much dismantled the unions in that state. And he barely skated by, and he remained governor. And then, of course, he had a bid for the presidency as well. Tom Luna may be a name that you remember from Idaho. There were the Luna laws, and those Luna laws were passed by the state legislature. And then the people held a referendum vote in Idaho on those policies called the Luna laws, and the people in Idaho ended up voting down all 3 of those Luna laws that the state legislature had passed in a referendum vote. And because of that, then they tried to have a recall vote of Tom Luna, who was superintendent of public schools, and they weren't able to get enough signatures to have a recall vote. But anyhow, these are 3 different vocab terms that you need to know, and they're all different ways that the people can have a strong voice in their local government, and a way that they can kind of bypass the legislature too, to create policy within their local state. Okay, let's start to look at some different elections that have taken place. The election of 1800 is really an interesting election. And you have to remember that at this time there were not primaries, there were no nominating conventions, there weren't these big candidate speeches, there weren't millions of dollars being spent on things. They didn't have people that were stumping for them and that were, doing speeches on their own. There certainly weren't celebrities like Beyonce out there having these benefit concerts and everything. So the election of 1800 looked very different than it did today. The presidents were often excluded from the campaigns themselves because it seemed undignified for the presidents to kind of get into the mud throwing that often took place, because a lot of these elections at this time were pretty nasty. So we think that our elections were nasty, have been nasty for the last few presidential elections or senatorial elections, and they certainly are. We're very polarized as a country. But you have to also realize that in 1800, the country was torn into essentially the Federalists and the Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans. And so really people were divided as well. And they were like, do we want more power to the states or do we want more power to the federal government? And so this election in particular was really nasty. It was really tough. And it was brutal, but the presidents tried to kind of stay out of it a little bit. The focus then was on the state legislatures, because the state legislatures were the ones that were choosing the electors, and they chose these electors in hopes that that elector would choose their guy. And the electors, of course, are not, well, it depends on the state. Electors can be bound by the state to vote for the popular votes now. But at this time, since it was just state legislatures that were choosing the electors weren't always bound to specifically vote for the person that the state legislators wanted them to vote for. So each of the electors, they got to cast 2 votes. Now, Jefferson tied with Aaron Burr. Now, what's crazy about this is that Jefferson and Aaron Burr were running together, but they all ran separate at the time. So they didn't, right now, the way that our elections are set up, we have candidates that run together. And so you have a president and a vice president, they run together on a ticket, but it didn't always used to be that way. So Jefferson was running, Aaron Burr was running, Adams was running. I don't remember who Adams' VP running mate was, but they all were listed. And so the electors cast 2 votes, thinking that they would vote for president and then also for vice president. But in this case, Jefferson and his vice president running mate tied. So here's a key thing that you need to know for the test and the AP test and my test, is that if there's an electoral college tie, which has happened and mathematically could happen again in the future, who determines the election? The House. The House decides who the president is going to be, and the Senate decides who the vice president is going to be. In this case, it would be they just went to the House because since they were running together, they were like, well, we'll see who is going to be president, and then who doesn't become president will become vice president. So it was just the House that looked at it. But today it would be the House that looks at president and the Senate that looks at vice president. So because this was so crazy, they ended up creating a amendment to the Constitution that said that, okay, now we need to technically have running mates. So what's also really interesting about this election is that, remember, this is the House that exists before the election happens. So you may be kind of thinking, this sounds familiar, this Jefferson-Adams election and this transfer of power and this freaking out over Federalist versus state rights. So this is Marbury versus Madison. This is the time, right? This is the election that created the situation that then led to my favorite Supreme Court case. So remember, though, that the House that's determining this election, they are Federalists. And they're ticked off because they only have 2 Democratic Republicans to choose from, Jefferson or Burr. And so amazingly enough, it's Alexander Hamilton that kind of comes to the rescue, and he blocks a bunch of votes and everything, and he ends up convincing the House to vote for Jefferson because he thinks that Jefferson is the lesser of 2 evils. So even though, of course, the Federalists all wanted Adams to win the election outright, they still were the ones that were determining who the next president would be, and they essentially determined that Jefferson was going to be that person. But the reason why this is so important is because it was a peaceful transfer of power between parties. Even though Adams was like, oh crap, what's going to happen? He didn't decide to bring in the army or something and not allow this peaceful transfer of power. He allowed it to happen. And so he set the precedence that even when an election is tough, even when it's nasty, the losing party gracefully steps down and allows this peaceful transfer of power to take place. So you will want to make sure that you read about the 2000 election in the book. I don't have enough time to really cover it in this lecture because I'm almost out of time. But it is something that we'll talk about in class, and just keep in mind that this was a modern example of when a president or someone could win the popular votes and lose the Electoral College. And so this election ended up being determined by the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore. And that's a really interesting question, too. Should the Supreme Court be the one that determined this presidential outcome? So make sure that you review that in the book, and again, we'll talk about that in class too. And then, of course, our most recent election, we see it yet again. And yet again, interestingly enough, it's a Democrat who wins the popular vote and a Republican who wins the Electoral College. So that's very interesting to see that trend happening. And is that going to continue to be a trend? So we will have a debate in class about the Electoral College and if it should still stay in place. Okay, just a couple of more terms that we need to look at. These are key terms for this unit. Citizens going to be voting. What determines if they're going to vote? One is legitimacy, the people's belief that the government has the right to rule. Do we believe that the government is legitimate? Do we believe in the voting process? Do we believe that rule of law is taking place? And if there's yes to all those questions, then people are going to be more likely to participate. Another big thing is political efficacy. This is a term you have to know. This is the belief that your political participation really matters. So I personally have a high sense of political efficacy. I believe in this process. I believe in getting involved. I believe that my vote matters. But if you know that there's a lot of voter fraud, if you know that ballots get stolen like they do in Mexico and Nigeria, then is your political efficacy going to be high, and will you participate in politics? And finally, civic duty is that belief that in order to support democratic government, citizens should vote. They need to vote. They need to participate. The most simple thing you can do in society is to vote. Your vote does matter. I know some of you guys may feel like it doesn't, but trust me, it does. And voter turnout rates are so dismally low that we have to get more people out voting. It's the very least that we can do to create a strong civic society. So that's it for this lecture. I think I'm going to have to do another brief lecture that covers the Electoral College as well. So thanks for listening.